If we don't act fast, coral reefs face extinction, threatening a quarter of all marine life. That's why we've built Hope Reef. Part of the world's largest coral reef restoration program. Because more coral today means more fish tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Martin Koehring. I'm the head of the Economist Group's World Ocean Initiative, which imagines an ocean in robust health and with a vital economy. The World Ocean Summit and the Inside Our webinars are an integral part of the work we do on accelerating a sustainable ocean economy. You can find out more about the World Ocean Initiative's work, including coverage of key themes discussed during the summit, but also during today's webinar on our website, ocean.economist.com. So welcome to this panel discussion on how business can drive positive ecological change in the ocean, sponsored by Mars Petcare. The discussion today is a part of a series of World Ocean Summit events in the run-up to the World Ocean Summit Asia Pacific, which will run virtually from December the 6th to the 10th this year, and also the World Ocean Summit 2022 in Lisbon from March the 1st to the 3rd, 2022. So, of course, this is such an important topic. Ocean-based industries such as fishing, aquaculture, renewable energy, shipping, tourism are all key contributors to the global economy. However, there's this, this need to really look at how these industries also pose risks to the environmental sustainability and biodiversity of the ocean. And as we know, many businesses are strongly focused on responsible ocean practice and also supply chains. There are many who are not yet taking sufficient action. At least it's encouraging that awareness about the importance and also value of nature and biodiversity is increasing. The recently published Dasgupta review, for example, on the economics of biodiversity describes nature as our most precious asset. And also the Economist Intelligence Unit recently released a study showing that nature loss and biodiversity issues are gaining more traction online than ever before, and that an eco-awakening is underway. So there are solutions, technologies, they exist to restore ocean health and create both socio-economic and also ecological value. And that's why it's so important to identify how business can be a key driver behind restoring the regenerative capacity of critical ecosystems, particularly also ocean ecosystems. And this is what we will be talking about today. I'm very excited to be joined today by 4 excellent and very experienced panelists. So first of all, we have David Smith, Professor and Chief Marine Scientist at Mars Petcare. Then we have Jennifer Morris, the Chief Executive at the Nature Conservancy. We have Rili Djohani, the Executive Director at the Coral Triangle Center. And we have Torsten Thiele, Visiting Fellow at the London School of Economics and founder of the Global Ocean Trust. You will find the full biographies of our panelists on the screen under this media player. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank again Mars Petcare for their support of this event. I would like to structure today's session in 4 parts. So first of all, we look at the role of business in restoring ocean biodiversity. So we will then look at how business can support a science-based approach to ocean restoration and conservation, and hopefully then also look a little bit at the kind of partnerships, collaborations, and local community work that is required to accelerate these solutions. And finally, also looking at scaling up projects and the role of finance. And we also have received several audience questions, and hopefully we get to some of those. And thanks for sending these in. So let's start with the role of business in restoring ocean biodiversity. So I would like to start with David. I mean, you work for a large business at Mars, while also retaining a position at university. So you engage the world outside academia regularly and also apply research to safeguard marine biodiversity for the future. From an academic's perspective, why do we need big business to become directly involved with conservation initiatives?
Well, thanks for that, Martin, and I'm grateful to be here today and an opportunity to speak to you. I span both worlds really. I still sit in academia, of course, but recently taken on this role, and that was partly because after 20 odd years of working in academia and carrying out specific research, it was noticed that the impact of that research was quite minimal, really, in terms of making the positive changes that we need. And really to get to the next level and to make the differences that we need to see in the time scale that we need to see it, then we really need to have a different approach. So working inside an industry that is heavily dependent on marine resources, has the right sort of infrastructure and the ethos to work in a sustainable way, can be a much more powerful way of sort of converting that research into real-time impact. So businesses who sort of depend on marine resources, my point of view, have a complete and utter responsibility, not only to have sort of limited impact, but also to have a positive influence in terms of regenerating marine ecosystems. So working with business produces new opportunities, not just to protect, but also to go that one step further and regenerate ecosystems. And of course, this is the decade of ecosystem restoration. And it really is an urgent matter. We are sort of missing time, really, or we're losing time. And we really need to make positive action straight away. And working through business allows you to maybe accelerate the impact of your research, accelerate the good practices, and to really have active interventions on the ground. And working with Mars Petcare, which of course is marine dependent in many of its products, sort of gives us that platform to do something very special and to shout loud and to demonstrate to other businesses around the world that actually you can make a difference. Sometimes if you look at the environmental problems we face, it's nearly insurmountable, but actually by doing projects and really sort of making the most of what you have, then you can make positive change. It's been really, really eye-opening, and working with experts from different sectors has also sort of allowed us to sort of have an accelerated impact, a positive impact in marine conservation, and really, again, changing from a no impact type scenario to actually having a positive impact or a nature positive influence. And that's been really rewarding.
And thanks a lot, David. I mean, this is important. I mean, to highlight that it's this kind of the urgent need for this accelerated impact that you highlighted, and the positive, the nature positive contribution that business can make. And I'd like to go to Jennifer now. And you have worked in conservation for more than 3 decades, and you led Conservation International in the past, and now the Nature Conservancy. What role can NGOs play in partnering with business to achieve greater conservation outcomes?
Great. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here, Martin. And I just wanted to pick up on what David said. You know, the role of business and the partnerships that businesses and NGOs can play has never been more important than now. And I think we're seeing that. You mentioned, Martin, in your opening, this global awakening. We don't have a lot of time. And the urgency requires radical partnerships. And so the collaborations that my organization, the Nature Conservancy, as well as many other nonprofit organizations, community leaders, local organizations, and of course, governments can play with companies is essential, because the reality is we're not winning yet. It's wonderful that more of the planet understands the interconnectedness between climate change and biodiversity and how we absolutely have to start restoring now, but we have to accelerate that restoration. And personally, the only way I think we can do that is by working constructively, pushing together, and developing really innovative initiatives on the ground that can scale. And that has to be with business. And the work that Mars is doing in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and many other organizations on reef restoration is absolutely amazing. And I hope we can talk about some of that, because it combines the genius of companies marketing, the ability to communicate in an effective way to touch hearts and minds and people that aren't underwater every day, to see what can happen when you work collectively with communities. But we need to scale those projects. As David said, we've got to make sure that those initiatives are not just wonderful rays of light around the world, but it's actually the way that we do business. You know, we've been getting a free lunch from nature for a very long time. And it's time that we give back. It's time that we restore. It's time that we work together with communities to help everyone on this planet understand the role that nature plays. And businesses are absolutely the critical part. I mean, David said it. The supply chain depends on a healthy planet. There are no jobs on a dead planet, as everyone has said. And so making sure that we're doing that in the marine ecosystems is critical. And quite frankly, what we've been doing so far hasn't worked. I mean, we've lost half of the coral reefs in the last 30 years. That has to stop. And the best way to do that is collectively working constructively, engaging and pushing each other to do more and do it faster.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. I mean, it's really important that, highlighting these radical partnerships. You mentioned reef restoration. Hopefully we get to some of the examples of how that works in practice, and the need for scale, as you mentioned, because of that supply chain dependency. We need to act, and you highlighted that sense of urgency as well. And I'd like to ask Rili as well. I mean, for more than 25 years, you have worked to improve the management and also financial sustainability of marine protected areas. And in your opinion, how can NGOs and the corporate sector develop capacity and the narrative together to support a sustainable blue recovery?
Thank you, Martin. It's great to be on this particular session on oceans. I'd just like to emphasize also the things that Jen has said regarding NGOs and the partnerships with business. I think it's pivotal, particularly now in this pandemic area, that we join forces together for a blue recovery. It's very important. I think everyone recognizes the interconnectivity and the complexity of ocean issues. And it's so critical that we join forces together and collaborate to find solutions. And I think one of the best examples we have at the moment in the Coral Triangle region is indeed the partnership also with Mars on coral restoration. And we saw, over time also in the Coral Triangle region that the missing link in this initiative is actually the business sector. We developed regional business forums in the past with partners to engage all kinds of sectors in ocean conservation, particularly from fisheries, shipping, finance, and others. And those business forums were very effective for a moment. But the real question is, how can you actually retain those partnerships long term and really work together in building capacity to secure the ecosystems in the oceans? Because in the past 2 decades or so, what we've seen is that there are a lot of very ambitious goals set by the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, SDG 14. We see that the most underinvested goal of all the 17 goals is actually in oceans. And we hope that really the business can drive, investment in this sector that also leads to ocean sustainability. And I think the ability of the private sector to mobilize science and capacity would be key to address a lot of those issues. And the partnership with the NGOs would be very complementary. NGOs can be really great catalyzers or facilitators with local communities who are pivotal in ultimately protecting their own coastal and marine resources. And having those partnerships in place and support governments in trying to achieve their SDG goals in this context, and also under the Global Convention on Biodiversity, would be critical to consider. So I welcome this forum, especially in addressing on how we can make those partnerships last, and also particularly bridging the different cultures between business, NGOs, government, and communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot, really, for highlighting this. I mean, the business sector, as you said, has in many ways often been the missing link, but you highlighted some of those collaborations now in fisheries, financing, and so on, and retaining those partnerships is important, as you said, and NGOs, as you said, can be facilitators for that. And I'd like to ask Torsten as well. I mean, you have worked with private and public organizations at the intersection of ocean governance and sustainable finance for many years. And in your opinion, what is required from business to support sustainable ocean solutions?
Yes, thank you very much. This is an exciting panel to be on. And I think the starting point to acknowledge for businesses that all range of businesses have had very significant impacts on nature and on the ocean. And it's not just the narrow definition of ocean businesses. It's a much broader range. The deoxination and the acidification of the oceans didn't come from ocean closed businesses. It came from a whole range of sectors, including fossil fuels. So business has had a big impact, but business can now have a big impact in trying to address some of these solutions. And the reason why business can do that is that business works at these larger scales. It's because business works through a very complex system of partners, of supply, but also of the use of data and technology and innovation. And it's that thrust, that driving innovation, the solution focus of business that we critically need here to address this very complex range of things. And if I take for an example, in a coastal ecosystem, we really need to think about blue infrastructure, where a combination of investments that work with nature-based solutions deliver the combination of what we need, which is clean water, renewable energy, real opportunities for local communities and livelihoods in a context that is biodiversity and nature positive. So this is the type of big challenge that the type of company that works with big data, that is able to think through complex problems, can bring a lot to the table. And it's really that additional push that we need to make these multi-stakeholder partnerships work. And we can, in particular in developing countries, not just rely on local government capacity. We need to complement that with the most advanced way of delivery, of thinking, of technology. And that's why this is such an important, but also such an attractive challenge for business, because this is about redirecting the way the economy works in a way that is nature positive.
Great, thanks a lot, Torsten. And it's really important to highlight, that all business in a way has an impact on the ocean. So often companies don't realize how interlinked, companies are with ecosystems, including ocean ecosystems. And you highlighted how important it is to bring business on board for that kind of data, innovation, tech angle. And I'd like to follow up on that. I mean, we mentioned already how important science-based solutions can be. And business can support these kind of science-based approaches to ocean restoration and conservation. And similarly, business and science and academic communities can encourage business participation. So it's kind of a mutual relationship there. And of course, David, you are at that intersection of science and business. In your experience, how can the synergies between science and business be harnessed for better ocean restoration and outcomes?
Well, it's quite difficult actually, because in most academic situations, and obviously I can only speak from experience, that often it's a communication issue. It's science, and particularly in the UK and no doubt in other countries, it's quite isolating in a sense. And scientists work in the scientific community, talk in a certain way, look at problems in a certain way as well. And industry works in a slightly different way, using different language, different terms, and different scales. So trying to get researchers and industry in a room to talk to each other to try and find where there's commonality is a key point. And certainly that's what has happened on the Mars program. So, there is a lot of science out there. There's a lot of research that's going on that still sits inside traditional academic journals, gets sort of reviewed a couple of times if you're lucky. If you might be lucky enough to get a really big impact paper, but generally there's so much research out there which actually goes no further than a scientific journal. If we can bring people together in a forum where people are relaxed and both sides are willing to try and find a solution to a problem, then I think that's where the magic happens. That's where you can start to say, look, these are the research solutions. The solutions at the moment fit in sort of the research remit, which is usually more small scale. Now, how can we work with business to activate that research at a meaningful scale. And certainly on the coral reef restoration program, to give an example, the big gains there in terms of what we can do is working with people from the business who have a different mindset. They look at the problem from sort of supply chain approach. They broke the problem down into little segments, trying to make those segments really efficient and effective in delivering an outcome, glue all that together to produce a process which means that the science which led to that process could be delivered at a much faster scale and rate. And then, of course, it's about using those or showing the world what those examples are. Look what can be done if you come together to try and find these solutions for a common purpose. The other addition, of course, or the other advantage you're working with big business, then there's a whole bunch of experts in different disciplines and marketing and communications that can then put that research and the outcomes into a bigger stage. And that's been quite remarkable. So I think it's about bringing people together in the right forum, both sides meeting each other halfway to activate that research at a scale that's going to make a difference, because it's a big problem. It's an urgent problem. And if we don't try and find that magic meeting point, then we're not going to be able to deliver what we need to deliver in the next decade. It's not a 10, 20, 30, 40-year problem. The problem needs to be solved now. This is it, this year, next year, not 20, 30 years down the line. And for that sort of rate, we need to get together around the table to deliver the solutions.
Great, thanks a lot, and David. I mean, obviously, forums like this also is about bringing people together. So it's really good to have these viewpoints. And often, as you mentioned, the science is working with business on the ground, but often the world doesn't know about it. So it's, as you said, there's also the communications angle and highlighting those best practices. And I'd like to go back to Torsten as well on this one. I mean, obviously, you're a visiting fellow at the LSE, but also you have always kind of work in this intersection as well. I mean, research and applying research to the reality of business and policy, which is a crucial aspect of your work. So how do you see the science-business relationship evolving when it comes to ocean restoration?
I think we've seen great progress, not just on ocean science around Earth systems, so the complexity of the structure as a whole, but also of that engagement then with policy. So the IPCC report and now the IPBES report are being brought to policymakers. We had science contributions made to the G7. We have an understanding now from the science side that this isn't just a natural science problem, that you need the social sciences just as much to make this transition come over, and that for scientists, they need to think of this not as an abstract issue, but as an issue of stewardship, of engagement. And so I think there's been a lot of progress from science to understand the substance, but also the moving points, the way to really shift this narrative. And that has led to a much stronger ability for science to engage both with civil society and with business as well as with politics. And one of the areas where I saw that very clearly is when we work in Europe with the Horizon Europe programs in the consortia that commit to look at certain specific issues and problems. We very often find not just 8 leading universities, but also 4, 5, 6 smaller companies, SMEs, who bring in a very specific technical angle, a very specific solutions angle. So I think it's that engagement across the range of business, from large to small, to innovative, to local, with the real capacity to understand what works on the ground. And that's where the science interface now sits. And we can really make progress on that basis.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Torsten. It's really important to highlight that this is not just a natural sciences issue. It's really much wider, and also the fact that there's innovation across a range of businesses and smaller companies as well as big companies getting involved, highlighting their technical expertise and what they can bring to the table. And also, Jennifer, at the Nature Conservancy, you often help to bring kind of cutting-edge science to support conservation projects and also provide consumer guidance. In your experience, how can business adopt a science-based approach to ocean restoration, and how can NGOs and civil society organizations facilitate this process?
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I just wanted to say how important it is that we highlight the role of applied science in conservation. And we're seeing, especially now that the urgency, as we talked about before, is so clear to so many people, especially the young scientists coming up in the field. They want to not just write really important papers, they also want to be on the ground with their fins in the mud and actually learning about how their science can help business, can help communities, can help governments to really change the world. And so we're seeing, at the Nature Conservancy, we have over 400 scientists globally who are working directly on applied technology and science solutions that can change the world. And I'll give you one example, which is actually related to the Mars supply chain. There's a company called Thai Union, which represents a very large percentage of tuna production globally. And for the longest time, because these ships are out to sea for so long, people don't see them. There are no eyes on these boats. And through a long negotiation with our science team, our technology team, with Thai Union, Thai Union has agreed to have 100% transparent electronic onboard monitoring on these boats. So that's a science technology solution where we're now seeing that businesses, because of pressure from within and pressure from externally, are coming to the table and saying, help us be better. And we're doing that through science, basically enabling people outside of Thai Union and within the supply chain to see what exactly are they catching. And as Torsten mentioned, it's also social science. It's not just about biodiversity and reducing bycatch and really understanding waste in the supply chain, but it's also making sure that employees on those boats are well treated, that the boats go to shore and they're actually monitored, and there's actually onboard monitors of these boats. So that connection, that's just one of the many examples that the Nature Conservancy and other organizations are using to bridge those two worlds, as David said, between academia and the corporate sector. We have to do that in creative solutions. But what's so amazing now is that so many young people, that's the work of science they want to do in the future. They want to be making a difference for the world. And we look forward to expanding those relationships with many companies who have that right ethos.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. And this applied science approach that you mentioned is very exciting, both for the scientists themselves, as you mentioned, they want to be on the ground, but also for business, because they can really then transform, as you said with this example, the Thai Union example, 100% transparent monitoring, and it's very impressive. So it's about also practical solutions. And the social sustainability angle you highlight is also one often forgotten in the social sciences element as well to the ocean conservation discussion. And really, I mean, I also wanted to ask you about this. I mean, you lead the Coral Triangle Center as kind of, as a learning center of excellence. So science and practical application of evidence is a core part of what you do as well. I mean, how can business be encouraged to adopt a science-based approach, in your opinion? And how can organizations like yours facilitate this process?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I would like to highlight the need to make the latest science accessible to groups on the ground who are actually engaged in conservation activities in marine protected areas and other sites. Often they don't have the access, but also the transfer of knowledge is very important. So, for example, Coral Triangle Center is focused on developing customizing training curricula for local government, local communities, local NGOs, all groups who are at the forefront of conservation, but who are in need of that latest science. But we try to make the science more accessible and more transfer them in a way that they can relate to it and also absorb it according to their own communications methods and so forth. Because we've seen over the years that a lot is lost in transfer of knowledge. Hence, we set up this foundation to really maximize the transfer of knowledge by customizing the information, and particularly the latest science. And we all embrace science to advance ocean conservation, ocean sustainability. But at the same time, there is a lot of local wisdom as well in the communities. And I think we also need to engage that type of wisdom and blend that with the latest science and come up with very practical and cultural aligned approaches to conservation. So I think NGOs like the Coral Triangle Center, who are perhaps closer to the field and the communities, we can play, I think, a key role in messaging that information to the groups that we work with, and also to groups who can in turn work with others on ocean conservation. And to date, we have developed around 26 training curricula that can be customized for different geographic contexts, different groups, different, for example, fishermen or community leaders, women. So I think it's very important to differentiate to whom you actually transfer the knowledge to, the latest science. And without that type of effort, I think a lot of science is lost, and we should really work together. That's why I think the business, the universities, they're really the generators of new science, and NGOs can really help facilitate that information to communities, local governments, and others. Vice versa, we can also engage a local wisdom, local rituals in conservation, and blend that in conservation approaches. And to date, we've trained more than 5,000 people, and also focus on institutionalizing this type of training efforts. So it's a sustainable effort to develop capacity over time, because I think one of the key things we underestimate is the capacity needed for ocean conservation. And just to think about the 2030 goals, if we like to put aside 30% of marine waters, the oceans and marine protected areas, we need to think through what that means in terms of capacity at all levels. Mm-hmm. And the role of business will be pivotal in helping to achieve that goal. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, really, for highlighting the need to make science accessible and the transfer of knowledge, and the need to make sure that the knowledge is not lost in this transfer, as you said, by relating to communities and working together with different groups. And you mentioned the example of customizing training curricula to help with that process. And this theme of working together and collaboration really shines through already, but I'd really like to focus more on that. And Jennifer as well, I mean, we have already touched on this importance of partnerships, collaborations, and local communities, and really already mentioned just how important that is to engage with local communities to really accelerate meaningful ocean restoration projects. And of course, at TNC, you're building partnerships across sectors, business, NGOs, government, academia, and communities. Could you elaborate on some of these collective actions you take and the best practices for collaboration that you could share with our audience?
Sure. So there are many, but I'll focus on a couple in the marine space. But to answer your question just now around best practices, I think that's really key. And it's, partnerships are tough. They're like marriages, right? And it's easy to say, let's do an innovative partnership. And, 9 times out of 10, those will fail, because the reality is you need to come to the table with a shared agenda. And you may not agree on everything, but you need to also be very, very clear about what you bring to the table and what others bring to the table, and be very humble and respectful of everyone's views. And it's easy to say, and often when you're in the heat of the moment within different institutions, it can be challenging to do. But I will say that, the partnership that we have with Mars in particular has just been phenomenal, because I think there's been a real recognition of everyone's roles, and really seeing that spirit of collaboration, of driving home something together, and to really see the opportunity to scale it in a way that we've never seen before, and that only through a company like Mars can do. And so I think that's one example of where we're actually working together to use the technology that they created and the community engagements that we have on the ground to come together to develop a reef restoration model in a place. They started in Sulawesi, and we were helping them there in Indonesia, and looking to now replicate that in the Caribbean and the British Virgin Islands. And we hope that this will be a model where governments are coming, and we're getting calls all the time from marine leaders around, both community and government leaders, as well as companies working in the marine space, because they're saying, we want to do this. How do we replicate this? This is amazing. This technology is phenomenal. And we have to show those examples and show the spirit and collaboration of those partnerships to really expand them. There's many others. For example, the Nature Conservancy is working in the tourism sector, which we haven't touched on here today. But of course, tourism is critical for so many communities around the world, been hit very, very hard by COVID, of course. And when tourism dries up, communities are really need to make sure that they have, of course, enough food to eat. So there's increased pressure that we're seeing in a lot of places where TNC works on the marine ecosystems right now as a result of that tourism decline from COVID. So we're working very, very closely with the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, and we're engaged with them on a whole reef habilitation program, which is, again, taking this model of, because those reefs are such critical natural capital for their livelihoods, making sure that those reefs are healthy. So they're companies that have a vested interest in ensuring their natural capital is preserved. And we, as a Nature Conservancy, of course, want to work together with communities and ensure that biodiversity is there for not only the planet, but also for their business model. So those are just some examples of the things that we're doing to ensure that collaboration is strong. We come to the table as interested parties, understanding the perspectives that we each have, but really driving for a common goal. And that, for us, has been the secret to partnerships around the world.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. And I think you highlighted something important, which is also that replicating great best practice, but at the same time working with local communities on their specific needs. And just like to go back to Rili on that one, because you had mentioned that you customize some of your training offerings to make sure that they are applicable to different contexts. And how do you make sure that some of the work that you do is also can be replicated around the world? I mean, the best practices you share. On the one hand, as we said, you want to tailor this for specific groups, but at the same time, you also want to set these examples. How do you ensure that some of your solutions are replicable and can be applied around the world?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Great question. I guess I also like to highlight our partnership with Mars in this context, because the potential of our partnership in Indonesia is I think, tremendous in terms of building on the experience from Mars in Indonesia for many years on coral restoration techniques, as well as our own experience in marine protected areas, and trying to blend this support on coral restoration throughout Indonesia to support restoration in marine protected areas and marine parks, I think is very promising, particularly because we are so complementary, and Mars bringing the science and the technology, and CTC brings the network with communities and local governments, and particularly also in relation to the priority of the government right now is economic recovery, and coral restoration is very much an integral part of that strategy right now from the government. So we can join forces together, align objectives, so we can support the economy, the livelihoods of local communities engaging in this program, but also provide technical support and guidance to the many coral restoration efforts that are mushrooming now in Indonesia. So I think what we bring to the table is sort of consistency and technical support, guidance to coral restoration. A lot of things can go wrong in that perspective, and there is really a need to provide technical assistance from a sort of a central task force perspective. And it's very well received by the private sector, by local communities, by local governments who are all embarking on coral restoration programs throughout Indonesia. So we provide the basic principles of coral restoration, also in the context of increasing coral resilience and in the context of supporting marine protected areas. But at the same time, we can package this information, for example, in the Moluccas would be quite different than if we work in Sulawesi or in Sumatra, taking into account the local configuration of the coral reefs, but also the socio-economic context. For example, in the Moluccas in Papua, you have much more local marine tenure systems that you can actually build into your training curriculum and support their cultural context in this way. But also in some cases, for example, you need to engage much more fishermen or other groups that would need a different approach and a different delivery of the training. But the core of the training is still the same, the basic principles of the science, but the way you deliver it and sort of using local case studies would very much help adoption of the information you like to transfer, but also in a way that a dialogue is possible. They can actually in turn also provide input on the training, or they can also say, okay, this coral restoration would not work in this place because they know very much the local conditions, for example, of the area. So I think it's very much an effort to provide a platform for dialogue, taking into account local customs, knowledge, but at the same time, what you can replicate, I think, is the science, the basic principles that we can apply throughout an archipelago like Indonesia.
Great, and thanks a lot, really, for highlighting that there is this balance is possible. So you have to have these kind of basic core principles of what works, but then applying it in different contexts and take into account the local configuration, as you mentioned, the cultural, socioeconomic context. And just to follow up on that as well with David, I mean, you mentioned earlier the importance of working in partnerships with industry and NGOs as well to boost the opportunities for scientists to amplify the impact of their research. Could you elaborate on this collaborative approach at Mars Petcare and examples of impactful collaborations in practice?
Yeah, let me just talk from an academic's point of view. There is a drive and recognition in terms of an academic's career these days that there's benefit to ensure that your research has big impact outside of academia. That's quite a shift in the needle a little bit in the last decade or so. Let's think about the next step in terms of restoration, and let me think also talk a little bit about the importance of you including all of the different parties in a conservation project, and make sure I support Jen and Rili in what they said about you working with local communities, and in fact the program, and it speaks to the partnerships really that we have in Indonesia. At the very core of that partnership has been the island communities that we work in, and the whole technology that we talk about. The technology we use is a very low technology solution, which is available to local communities so that they're able to, once a certain amount of capacity and training has been put in place, they are able to use and in their own way and make sure that they restore their reefs. They're not our reefs. We're just there to provide some expertise and assistance in a sense, and sometimes the capital to support it. So, the very sort of epicenter of the partnership is the community in which we work in, and also then us, which is there to help. Sometimes that ground partnership, that core partnership, might not be communities. It might be actually the tourism industry. There's there might be a vested interest in a tourism industry restoring a particular part of their reef to protect coastal environments or to increase biodiversity, which has intrinsic value for the tourist trade. So the actual partnerships depends in the situation you're in, and that can be quite flexible, and it has to be flexible. In terms of the next stage in restoration, and the biggest problem, and this is where you really need to be working with business, as all of the panelists have said, is going from the small scale to a demonstration scale, which I think there are at the moment, to a scale where we really are going to sort of reverse the trend in global loss of coral reefs, and to really start pushing back in terms of what we really need to do for conservation. And that's a huge, huge step to get to. There, we need science to tell us, well, what is the best way to get to scale? Where should we focus our efforts in protection and restoration? Can we sort of increase our ecological footprint or a smaller physical footprint? If we locate restoration in location A, you will have spillover into wider areas that can regenerate reefs next by and replenish systems further down the line. That's where you need modelling. You need different types of science to come in and help you with that. But even to do that, you need to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place and the funding to help you do that. So, to get to the next level in restoration, and also regeneration of marine ecosystems. You need a combination of partnerships, science, social science, natural sciences, physical oceanographers to come together to try and form these solutions. The NGOs are extremely important because, as Jen and Rili has said, they're the activators in a sense to allow us to go and do these projects into different situations. They're the interface between science and industry, in a sense, sit in the middle to help us do that. So that's really incredibly important. You know, in terms of Mars Petcare, the restoration is extremely important. It's a flagship project. We know we need to regenerate ecosystems if we're really going to have a positive impact on ocean health. But there's also partnerships we formed with NGOs to ensure that we are much more sustainable in what we do today, not just looking forward to what we regenerate into the future. And there we formed relationships with WWF, for example, to ensure that our fisheries are as sustainable as they possibly can be. And, you know, we're quite proud of where we've got to in that level. And we've just signed another agreement with them, with the WWF for the next 5 years to try and push the boundaries and become sort of leaders in that area to really drive the levels of sustainability we need. And it's a horrendously complex situation because most of the time you're trying to sort of get these ideas of sustainability, making sure everything's okay, and you're retrospectively fitting it into an industry that when that all started, that wasn't the case. So how do you do that? You know, and that's really complicated, and it requires what Jen said, you know, electronic monitoring. We need to get the data. We need to prove that data and monitoring has a positive impact. We then need to incorporate that throughout the supply chain. So it's really complicated, and that's where all the partnerships come together.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, David. And you highlighted something very important, which is the combination of partners is important. And you mentioned, you know, bringing the right scientists with the NGOs, the activators, as you to call them, together, and to bring this interface of science, industry, and civil society together, and tailored partnerships as well. As you said, you know, in some areas like the fisheries work we do with WWF might be a different partner than in other contexts. So being flexible in those partnerships is crucial, as you mentioned. Conscious of time, I would like to focus now on the scaling up a bit. You know, you mentioned how important it is to scale up, and David, you just highlighted that, and the role of finance in particular. But before I do that, I would just, Torsten, also to just ask you very briefly before we get into the finance aspect. Of course, at the Global Ocean Trust, you work through a number of coalitions and alliances to promote better ocean governance, to encourage ocean solutions. You have, for example, the High Seas Alliance. Could you tell us briefly a little bit more about these collaborations and how they help to facilitate and accelerate progress on ocean restoration?
Absolutely. And I think it is indeed important that we have common understandings and common positions. And so the High Seas Alliance has been key to develop an approach to large marine protection in the high seas. We need to understand that half of the planet is high seas. It needs to be governed properly. The work we've done with the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation with TNC and others and financial firms has been key about identifying examples, developing blueprints so that people can see in practical terms how this can be implemented at a project level. And then the work we've done with IUCN around the Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility is really a way to support those kinds of projects that go beyond the blue carbon or the livelihoods, but have an integrated approach that really deliver on biodiversity, on resilience, on the physical risk adaptation side at the local level, but also on multiple revenue streams. So these are all examples of how, by bringing the effort together and working on a common framework and a common approach, we are much more likely to show that these solutions can be put in place. And if I then move on to the scaling of the solution, I think we then need to add a few more components. It's not just sufficient to sort of try to make things bigger would work at a project level. It's really about setting frameworks and standards. So we developed the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles as really an entry point for the finance industry into all of these topics we are discussing. And they are now hosted by UNEP FI and provide a really helpful starting point for finance. We now see a great response from the finance sector, both in terms of their own refocusing, because obviously financing the right kind of projects and aligning away from the wrong kind of projects is at the core of this. And so the finance industry, including, interestingly, the financial regulators and the central banks, are putting in a significant effort at this shift. So we have not had only the task force for climate-related disclosures, now we have a task force for nature-related disclosure. And it's so important that we bring these together and deliver what I call an ocean finance architecture, a way forward that can mobilize significant capital in a way that also reduces risk, so that beyond the leadership that will need to come from multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, other blended finance partners, we get the opportunity for large private sector patient capital to seriously commit to the natural capital space. And that's why I speak about blue natural capital as an emerging asset class, as a way of thinking, where would you like to put your money in the long term? You want to put it into the one sector that will continue to deliver restructured wealth, and that is nature. And so we need to structure these tools and deliver these opportunities. And the finance industry is really waking up to this opportunity. So it's a very exciting moment of engagement across finance, both from the public and from the private sector side, and bring finance along to support at the local level, at the business level, and at the civil society level. So I think that it just shows that by investing both at the small and at the large scale, finance can support this transition successfully.
Thanks a lot, Torsten. And you mentioned something important, which is this common framework, and getting the framework right is so important. And as you said, I mean, there's this ocean finance architecture emerging with new asset classes and new opportunities for scaling up. And just conscious of time, very briefly as well, I'd just like to ask about this scaling up opportunity and the role of finance. If you could keep it to about 1 minute or so, really as well, I would just like to ask you as well, I mean, given that financial sustainability of marine protected areas is an important aspect, and just in your experience, how can ocean conservation and restoration be scaled up with, of course, with the right finance tools? What's your view on that? Very brief.
Well, I think scaling up for me is really about engagement strategies. So, who and how do we engage the right people at the right time to scale up efforts, for example, for marine protected areas. Right now, for the Coral Triangle Initiative, which is an epicenter for marine biodiversity, we are really partnering up with all the NGOs, including the Nature Conservancy, WWF, WCS, to work on a very focused strategy to scale up our efforts in the Coral Triangle countries to support the countries with achieving the 30 by 30 goal by 2030. So how can we set aside 30% of the marine waters in the Coral Triangle by 2030? And the enabling conditions in the field of policy, building human capital, and sustainable financing are the three pillars for this strategy. And very key for us at the moment is how do we engage business, how do we engage women leaders, local government executives. So one of the successful strategies in the Coral Triangle context has been the development of learning networks. So how can you maximize sharing and learning among those key agents of change in such a big region to really turn the tide and achieve conservation at scale. And I'm hopeful that in the next 10 years, by putting together our efforts behind a very tangible goal and trying to translate that in terms of policy capacity, human capital, and sustainable financing, we can actually really achieve it. But for me, it's very evident that you need to engage people right from the start. And this is something where I think business, government, NGOs can work together, and not to underestimate a common narrative, because very often the narrative is not the same, and working together on a, for example, Coral Triangle narrative that is really consistent and is also presented by the world leaders at global forums is critical to push things in the right direction. And I think media partnerships are also very important in this context. So going to scale for me is about engaging strategies and thinking through how we can get the information to the people in the right time and in the right way to achieve successful conservation at scale. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Rili. And yeah, it's important to highlight that sustainable financing is one of the pillars, as you said, of the 30 by 30 goal, and that engagement is crucial. And just briefly as well, given the running out of time, unfortunately, obviously Jennifer, the Nature Conservancy, has worked on innovative financing for coastal resilience for a number of years. And in your experience, briefly, how can the required funds be mobilized to invest in key areas to support sustainable ocean restoration?
Yeah, so I think Torsten picked up a really important point, which is how do we ensure that we go from projects and kind of CSR to true DNA, and DNA not just within companies, but DNA within country governments that see the role that natural capital, in this case, blue natural capital, can play in shoring up business and community livelihoods. And I just give you one example that takes, going from project to really hopefully scaling, and that's around insurance. So TNC and partners in Mexico developed a really innovative parametric insurance product, which recognized the value of coastal reefs, of reef ecosystems and marine ecosystems to the tourism industry, and paid out when a storm hit and destroyed those reefs, $800,000 in one go with one storm because of the system and the structure of how it was created. Now, that was one example. We're looking to scale that in other places. But until we recognize the role of natural capital and the value of natural capital in the entire ecosystem of our economies, we're only going to have project by project. So we've got to make sure that our governments are really leaning into the importance of nature and valuing nature long term. That's how we get to scale with the finance coming in, using the power of the insurance sector and other private sector actors to recognize the important value that nature plays.
Yeah, great point, and reiterating the need for the blue natural capital approach is really vital. And before we get to the audience question, just David as well, I mean, you mentioned earlier the urgent need to include big business delivering large-scale conservation solutions, and given the huge funds as well and resources that business can bring to the table. But how can we accelerate and scale up funding, capacity, innovation in this space?
Well, let me go back to the partnerships. This question of scale can be leveled to the different partners. In terms of the science, there's funding needs to be injected into the science that can underpin the restoration scale question. That would require that would answer questions such as the where do we do restoration? How can we use smart ecological design to increase the scale on which we can work? How do we increase the rate of ocean recovery using science? And I think there's avenues there. I'd also agree that governance infrastructure is not there yet. We've seen this even for NPAs and never mind new science that's trying to capitalize on new techniques in the ocean to generate ocean health, such as restoration, regeneration. So governance systems need to be in place. And of course, we also need the NGOs to be supported because the NGOs are going to help us activate the restoration and regeneration projects in the places where they need to be activated. And in those different locations, there will be different businesses and industries that have a vested interest. We need to bring those industries in the right place, in the right time, with the right partners. So if it's storm damage protection insurance, for example, that's going to be more suitable in certain areas. If it's tourism, it's going to be more suitable in different areas. So it's that mosaic bringing all together. But the key point, again, is making sure that the international community recognize the value of ocean health. We're on a blue planet. We cannot survive without a sustainable way of utilizing ocean resources. It underpins everything we do, and it's an urgent need for us to protect it.
Great, thanks a lot, David. And you highlighted the need to leverage the right partners, but also governance systems, and that really shines through as well as a key element. Just finally, on the audience question, we had a question that was related to offsetting. I mean, there are many offsetting initiatives that invest in planting a tree, for example. And are there any good offsetting initiatives that focus on investing in our oceans? Any quick thoughts on that? Maybe Jennifer or Rili, who has an answer for
that? Sure, I can take a stab. So I think, again, offsetting only works when companies who are buying the offsets are committed to driving changes in their own companies. So it's really critical that we think about offsetting only from a high quality perspective. The role of nature-based offsetting, or in this case, protecting mangroves, et cetera, is I think great. And there are some examples that are happening. There's some in Colombia. There's some that TNC is doing in the US. So those are focused on mangrove protection and seagrass beds as well. So we're still on the margin of the land. What I'd love to see is offsetting more in the deeper ocean, because we're recognizing the role that sediment and the loss of sediment plays in carbon emissions in a really powerful way. So being able to look at offsetting in that perspective and the critical role that ocean ecosystems play more broadly in our climate stabilization is really key. So it's still a very nascent market, but we're excited to see opportunities there as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Anyone else who wants to comment on that? Okay, brilliant. Then I would really like to thank all the panelists for their time. It's just really incredibly insightful. I'd just like to summarize briefly. I mean, obviously we heard, all about, the need for industries to move to this kind of net positive conservation impact, kind of being nature positive, and moving to this kind of a regenerative approach rather than just a do no harm approach. Obviously, the importance of the local communities was mentioned, the ownership of the solutions as well, the inclusiveness, the need to find solutions at scale through partnerships, through collaborations, to creating kind of platforms to innovate and scale approaches, the need for innovative finance, blue natural capital was mentioned as an important aspect, and of course, the need for governance systems to support that. So thanks a lot again to the panelists and to the audience as well. Stay tuned for the next event in the series on August the 18th, which is the Inside Hour supported by Callista on achieving sustainable aquaculture. A few more key dates to mention. We have the World Ocean Summit Asia Pacific in December the 6th to the 10th, to be a virtual event. And then we have the World Ocean Summit 2022. We're already getting very excited about that, of course. March 1st to March 3rd, 2022 in Lisbon, in Portugal. So thank you again to our panelists and the viewers, and of course, Mars and Petcare for their support. Goodbye for now, and we hope to welcome you again soon.